sitting down to make a video. Oh, hi, I didn't see you there. Kidding. Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. Today, let's talk about background vocals, specifically how to mix them, because in my opinion, background vocals are one of the coolest elements you can add to your productions to give it something unique that you won't hear anywhere else. There's a chance that someone else could use the same synth pad patch that you're using, or the same guitar tones and things like that, but no one else will have your exact voice and be able to arrange it and make it sound exactly like what you're doing. Now, I'm not talking about making every track into some giant Queen Bohemian Rhapsody, exhausting experience, but just a way of adding an extra element in the background. It's not for every style of music, it's not for everyone, but if it intrigues you and you want to add more into your music and also learn how to mix it quickly and get it to fit in the mix, because you can have great background vocals that completely jack up your mix if you're not careful. Continue watching. If you've listened to any of my music over the years, you know I love to use background vocals, probably almost to a fault, but that means I have a lot of experience and can share a lot of ways to get them to sound good. So whether you're doing something like an a cappella recording, what language shall I borrow? Okay, admittedly, that's a little different, but same kind of principles apply. Or maybe you're doing just some more traditional background vocals to back up what's happening with the main vocal in a chorus, for example. It's supposed to be the change is coming. Or maybe you occasionally throw in some sort of opera vocal because you hadn't had much sleep and you thought it was a good idea. Let's not talk about that. Or maybe you want to go all Muse and throw in a whole bunch of background vocals and then have them all hold out this fully diminished chord at the end. That could work too. Needless to say, I have a lot of fun with background vocals. Now, at some point, I want to go in depth and do maybe a live stream or a longer video where I talk about the different ways to come up with these parts. Most of the time, it's just one part kind of pops in my head and I sing that and I double it. One of the keys is always double it. So if you can see here, we've got 6 tracks here. It's actually just 3 parts. Each one is doubled and panned left and right. And that final note, we add 2 more parts. So we have essentially 5 notes happening, but there's 10 tracks. Does that make sense? Everything's doubled. So that's the first thing. It gives you all the benefits of doubling, lets it be nice and wide without being lopsided, all of that stuff. But I'm singing a part and then I'm coming up with the next part and singing that and then just building it as I go. Almost like those folks who do loop production and are building loops as they go. That's kind of the way I work through background vocals, but that's a subject for another day. Let's talk about how do we mix tracks like this? What do we do to get them to fit? Because as you can imagine, if you were to listen to these raw tracks, you would discover that it's not, I talk about getting it right at the source a lot, how the source tracks need to be great. If the source tracks are good, the final mix is good. Background vocals are one of those situations where, yes, the parts need to be good and it needs to be on pitch and have a certain vibe, but the actual raw recordings, when you blend 4 to 10 vocals together, you're going to necessarily have some problems. Here's what they sound like. That's that same vocal I just played for you. Here's the raw tracks. Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out to get me. Why won't they leave me alone? So by themselves, they don't sound half bad. I kind of backed off the mic so it's not super muddy like you sometimes get. But in the mix, you can tell this just isn't really working. Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out to get me. Why won't they leave me even when I pull it down in the mix like I just did, they go from being too much to being kind of disappeared, or just feeling almost like naked and exposed. It's kind of like in rock and roll, a raw snare drum in its natural habitat is usually not the sound on the final record, right? It usually has a good amount of compression on it. That's the sound of a rock snare that we're used to. You hear a snare drum on, like, the intro to a Foo Fighters song. That sound of that snare is reminiscent of what the original snare sounded like in the room, but it's been squashed in a good way to make it have all that richness and bring out all the harmonics and make it pop and snap and all those words we like to use. Same thing with background vocals. So let's just go through and let's reprocess these. I'm going to delete what's there and start from scratch just to show you how I would approach that. So hold on one second. I'm going to remove everything from this session but the background vocals just to make this a little easier to see visually. Okay, now it's a little cleaner, a little easier to see. The tracks in purple are my background vocal tracks. By the way, purple is the official color of background vocals. And as you can see, there's no plugins on these. That's the way I like to roll. On a rare occasion will I EQ like one that's just tonally a lot different than the others, like a lower part that's too muddy. But otherwise, they generally have similar tones. So I'm going to process all of those on the bus itself, which is known as top-down mixing. Okay. Now let me remove this too. Now each of these tracks, as I mentioned before, they're all panned left and right. So this is part 1, this is part 2, panned opposite each other, and they're all routed to this red bus here, which is labeled BGV. Now these white colored tracks over here, these are all my effects. This is typically what I put into my mix sessions. These are always there in my template. A couple different reverbs, couple different delays. They're just there waiting for me to send something to them, and I'm going to do that in a second. I'll talk about these in just a minute. So again, to refresh our memory, here's what these background vocals sound like.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out.
So it's just very raw, and this needs to sit on top of an already dense mix, which sounds like this.
Oh, every time I try to break free.
A lot of stuff happening there. Anyway, these need to sit well, still be heard, right? We don't want to do anything that's not going to be heard, but these right now are just kind of ick. So let me just I'm going to use simple tools here. Normally I'd throw a fat channel on here and use kind of some fun EQs and compressors, but this time I'm just going to use the stock compressor and EQ that come with Studio One. So which order? So right now I've got the compressor first and the EQ. I can move it around so I can have the EQ first and then the compressor. Here's my basic rule of thumb when it comes to compression and EQ as far as what order to do them. I never do it the same way twice, but I have a general rule of thumb that I use. If the track already sounds good, first of all, I need to establish that I want to use EQ and compression. So for background vocals, I usually do want some compression on there because, especially a song like this, I want them to cut through and I want to hear the consonants and hear the air of the vocal that typically gets lost if there's not some compression there. So that's the first thing. You don't have to compress everything. But if you've decided, yeah, I'm pretty sure I want compression and EQ on this, which one do you do first? For me, if the track already sounds pretty good, I'll compress it first. If the track sounds kind of bad or needs some work EQ-wise, I'll EQ it first, then compress. The idea is compression is going to bring out a lot of things. And if there's a lot of bad in the audio itself, compression is going to bring up the badness as well as bring up the good stuff. Otherwise, if we EQ it first and get rid of some of the badness that's there, now the compression is only has good things to work with, and compressors tend to like to work with good things, okay? But you can always break the rules, but that's kind of where I start. So as I said before, these actually sound pretty good to me.
Oh, every time I try to break free.
So I'm going to go ahead and try some compression on this. Now, the way I use compression on this is a lot like I use on vocals. I'll go a fairly fast attack, so we grab it really quickly, fairly quick release, so that we release it quickly. And then I'll go pretty aggressive. So I'll bring the ratio up to something like 4:1, and then pull the threshold back and just get it slamming that compressor pretty hard.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out.
So as you can see, I'm compressing all the vocals together. One of the things that happens is sometimes if the release is a little too fast, it'll have this kind of shaky sound to it. Listen to that again.
Oh, every time I
It's because the release is releasing too fast and it's just weird. So I'll just make the release a little bit longer. That should smooth that out.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out.
Already sounds better. Let's see if we can get a little more aggressive with it. Why not?
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out.
Now I'm going to increase the makeup gain so that this input volume, the original volume, is similar to the output volume, although it was already a little too loud, so we might not match it all the way.
Oh, every time.
You know what? For the sake of argument, let me just get the volume at a better level to begin with.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone.
That's more of an appropriate volume for this mix. Now we'll set the compressor.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out to get me. Why won't they?
So what you're hearing is a lot of what we love about a compressed vocal is coming through on these background vocals. The beginnings of phrases, every time those consonants are kind of sharper and more forward, so we can understand in the context of the full mix what's being sung.
Oh, every
time that T comes through, that the sibilant comes through. That's one of the side effects of compression. It causes those details to jump out. That can be bad sometimes. It can do it too much. But in this particular instance, it's working pretty well. So let's listen back and see what we got.
Oh, every time I try to break
A little too much compression. Let's pull back on the ratio a little bit.
Oh, every time
I'm going to make the release a little bit longer.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out.
That feels really good. Now, overall pretty great, but I want to EQ it a little bit because it needs a little bit of work. First thing we'll do, we'll just roll off the extra low stuff. I don't think there's a lot there, but in case there's a plosive where I sing a P and it makes the mic go whoa, we want to make sure that doesn't come through. There's a bass note there. The main melody is oh, every time and then I doubled that an octave down. Oh, every time I want to make sure that's heard but not muddy. So I'm going to try to bring some lows down first.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out to.
So I just took down a little bit at 200 hertz. 200 hertz is a great place for frequencies to build up when you have multiple of almost anything, guitars and vocals especially. It tends to build up there and just get out of balance. So I pulled that down just a little bit.
Oh, every time
Now we can almost, I almost don't even want to say this because someone's going to take it the wrong way, but we can actually look visually at this spectrum and see, okay, there's a lot of stuff happening here as well in like the 500 hertz range. It's another place where a lot of buildup can happen. I'd like to, almost always on background vocals, I will do this big cardinal sin of EQ where I'll just do a big wide, not that wide, cut in the mid-range, something like this. And what happens is it takes some of the fakeness of the vocal, some of that kind of sound out, so it just sounds clearer. So take a listen to what that sounds like. I'll turn it off and then I'll turn it on.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out to get me. Why won't they?
Just crisper. It's thinner. It's almost harsher. Feels like we boosted the highs. We didn't. We actually just took away some of the mids that were building up. And finally, if you want to just give a little extra crispiness, you can take the frequencies way up here at like above 8K and try to do just a little bit of a boost. Let's see if we can make that work.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out to get me.
I love the air that comes through on the vowel sounds, but now the consonants are a little too punchy. There's too much sibilance now. So what do? Well, now we bring in some form of de-essing. So I've got a de-esser preset that I use on the multiband compressor that comes with Studio One Pro. It basically takes everything above 2K. Everything down here below 2.5K, nothing happens. But everything up here gets hit with compression in the 2 to 4K range and then above 4K.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out.
So listen to what happens on like the word try. That T is now slapped down. So we have a nice airy sound on the vocals, but then when a T comes along, it gets turned down, but we were able to maintain the brightness that we got before.
Oh, every time I trying to break free. Everyone's out to get me.
So it seems counterintuitive. We made the vocals brighter and have more of that sibilantness that I talked about before, but now we're turning it back down. Haven't we just kind of canceled ourselves out? No, actually. What we did is we brought the sibilance forward in the mix, and then we're using this to kind of find that sweet spot that wouldn't be there had we not compressed it at the beginning. That compression is bringing the sibilance up, and now this multiband is just taking care of those high frequencies so we can have them nice and bright, but then when it gets too bright, it pulls it back down. You can't really do that with EQ or even like normal compression. You really need some sort of multiband compression to make that happen. So now the only thing left to do is maybe add a little bit of reverb. So depending on the song, I'll add some sort of plate reverb usually. Here's the one that I have in my session.
Oh, every time
Not a super huge reverb, but nice and gives it some space. One thing to keep in mind as well, in addition to what we've already done, I would say always EQ your reverbs. So this is coming on a send from my vocal bus over to this reverb channel, and then after the reverb plugin, I've got this EQ plugin. Now, I don't always do the cuts here, but I always roll off the low end, because a lot of times what happens is you get muddiness in your mix and you think it's on your background vocals, for example, but you took care of that, but somehow the reverb itself is muddy. And sometimes it's hard to find because you just hear the muddiness and you're not sure where it is. This prevents that. I almost never have a need for any frequencies below 200 hertz in my reverbs, and that allows me to have a nice, clean reverb that I can hear that never muddies up the mix. So here's kind of the final sound of that vocal.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out.
So here's before.
Oh, every time I try to break free.
And here's after.
Oh, every time I try to break free, everyone's out to get me. Why won't they leave me alone?
Super fun. Now, when they came in, they were a little quiet on the overall mix, so I just bumped up the fader just a little bit, but it works. If I were to do this for another 10 minutes, I'd probably find a upper mid-range frequency and bring that down a little bit so it doesn't fight with the lead vocal. But generally, this is my approach to background vocals almost every time. I may not de-ess them every time. I may not compress them every time, but I'll always do kind of a scooped EQ on them, and that gets this sound. Is this the right sound for every background vocal you'll ever use? No, it might not be. But for me, I've done lots of different styles of music, as I showed you at the beginning, to where it's just very bare with just vocals a cappella, or simpler songs with background vocals, or big dense mixes. And these are kind of the tones that I'm able to get that work across a lot of different styles. All right, thanks so much for sticking with me to the end of this video. Go do some background vocal recording. And if you haven't checked out my VIP membership, I don't talk about that a lot here, but it's one of the funnest things that I do. Go to homestudiocorner.com/VIP to check it out. It's super inexpensive, and every month we do new challenges. This month we're doing one where we're creating a song from scratch using just MIDI and only 2 audio tracks. Sometimes it's mixing, sometimes it's mastering, sometimes it's editing. A lot of times every time there's some music being created, and it's a really fun community. I'd love for you to come check it out. All right, thanks for watching. If you have questions, leave a comment. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.